Episode 148 of the Interpretation Station is Call to Order. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. How is everybody doing? Today we have a new episode of the Interpretation Station for you. It's the second part of a three-parter on that most thrilling of subjects, the Sustainable Development Goals, or as you may like to call them in your language, les ODS, los ODS, ZUR, and whatever other variations there are in the various languages of the world. So I did the first part of this a couple of weeks ago. You may recall we did SDGs 1 to 5. I'm going to put the link up to that first one, that first part 1 there. If you haven't watched that episode already, I'd recommend you probably start there. It makes more sense. That was initially going to be, I was initially just going to do it in 2 parts, 1 to 8, 9 to 17. But goals 1 to 5 were so dense with information that I had to just basically just stop after goal 5. I was about to collapse. So this way I'm doing 3 parts, okay? Now I have actually, I did film this episode, or I have filmed this episode already once. I filmed it last night. Yes, I spent my Saturday night filming an episode of the Interpretation Station. That's pretty sad, isn't it? Saturday night. There's a reason why I had to do that. There's a story behind it. It's an unfortunate story to do with teenagers. Anyway, I filmed it, spent 50 minutes, got up to goal 9, and then my computer crashed. God, that was annoying. And then on top of that, during the night, so my dog, Maggie, the Interpretation Station mascot, had a bit of a dicky tummy. And I had to take her out twice in the middle of the night. So I slept badly. Episode came to naught. So yesterday was a pretty rubbish day. So here we go again. We're going to try again. At least I'll sound quite professional when I'm doing it, because I know exactly what to expect now, what the key words are. And so without any further ado, without me blabbering on any further, let's just get down to business, get down to the next goal, which is goal 6. I advise you, as I say, because I'll be following this, I'll be working off the English version, which is the most up-to-date version of the goals online. Unfortunately, the goals in the other languages, their web pages haven't been updated as much as the English one. But I'd advise you, those goals, they've been translated, I think, into probably every different language under the sun. So it doesn't matter if you know English, you're working into or from English, I would advise you to find the version of the goals translated into your language, so that you can sort of correlate what I'm saying with your version of the text, and that way I can tell you what the key expressions are, what the buzzwords are. So as I say, this really should be accessible to anyone who's working in or who aspires to work in, international organizations, geopolitics, interpreting those kind of fora. So yeah, let's get on. Let's get things going and turn to SDG 6. Okay, so here we go then. If you recall, the way to get to the SDGs, at least in English, you just you Google SDGs, and it's basically the first link, and it'll take you here, sdgs.un.org. This was sort of the site that we were using as our sort of launch pad, shall we say, in the last episode. If you remember, I told you in the other languages, unfortunately, the French, Spanish, Russian, that it hadn't been updated. So you remember you had these graphics here, which you didn't have in the other pages. So the best site I found in the other languages to follow this was to just basically go here, un.org/sustainable development, and here then you have the other language versions, because here you can find it gives you the targets and the targets. It doesn't give you the indicators, because if you recall, in the English version, it's all broken up. Here you have the graphic, and then you have the targets and indicators, which is what the sort of really important stuff is. So in these ones here in the French, on this page you can get the les cibles. For example, here, okay, les cibles. So anyway, we'll come back to that in a minute. But so let's begin again with the English version. So goal 6, ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. The world's water-related ecosystems are being degraded at an alarming rate. Often, when they talk about the environment, they tend to talk about degradation, things degrading as opposed to deteriorating. It's a minor thing. It's just, it's good to just know these things. So when things are getting worse in environmental terms, it tends to be degradation that's used. Over the past 300 years, over 85% of the planet's wetlands have been lost. That's an important word, okay? Wetlands. I couldn't remember it in the languages last night. I had to look it up, so now I can tell you what they are very professionally. You see, in Spanish they call them humedales. Okay, they'll get mentioned in a few minutes' time when I come to the targets. And in French it's zone humide. And I can't remember what the Russian version is. But we'll look at that as well. But that's an important thing to know, wetlands, because I've heard them used in Spanish, humedales, and I've not known exactly what it is. But I do know, because that's the power of the interpretation station. Meeting drinking water, sanitation and hygiene targets by 2030 requires a 4 times increase in the pace of progress. Drinking water, you'll sometimes hear that used interchangeably with potable water. Certainly, I think in French they use l'eau potable, and if anything, I probably use potable water more. But anyway, potable water, drinking water. Current rates in 2030, 1.6 billion people will lack safely managed drinking water, 2.8 will lack safely managed sanitation, will lack basic hand hygiene facilities. What have we got over here? For at least 3 billion people, the quality of water they depend on is unknown due to a lack of monitoring. 733 million live in countries with high critical levels of water stress. Only 1/4 of reporting countries have 90% of their transboundary waters covered by operational arrangements. This is an important notion, okay, the idea of transboundary waters. All these big bodies of water around the world, lakes. It usually applies to like inland waters, like rivers and lakes. You have many what are called transboundary water commissions set up between the various countries that border a given body of water, and in those commissions. The lake. There's one for any water course you can think of. For example, in Africa, the Lake Chad, the Niger River. Okay, all the countries adjacent have like commissions via which they settle any disputes, and they sort of try and ensure that the management of those water courses is properly handled. So that's an important. That will get mentioned in the targets coming up. So transboundary water is an important concept. So let's have a look now at the targets then for goal 6. 6.1, by 2030 achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. Proportion of population, then the indicator proportion of population using safely managed drinking water services. 6.2, achieve access to adequate, equitable sanitation and hygiene for all, and end open defecation, paying special attention to the needs of women and girls and those in vulnerable situations. This is an important concept, okay, open defecation. That will get referenced quite a bit in like meetings on the SDGs, on social economic affairs. So it's important to know what the equivalent is in your other languages. So I think it's fairly straightforward. I think so. In Spanish, you see la defecación al aire libre, and I think it's pretty similar in the French. Defecation en plein air. Okay. So again, I'll be focusing more on the French and Spanish than I will on the Russian, just because the French and the Spanish, it tends to be more. I'd say the SDGs tends to get more of a priority, perhaps in Spanish and French-speaking countries. With the Russian-speaking countries, I think they tend to be less active on those issues when in meetings, maybe because there are fewer of them, I guess, than there are French and Spanish-speaking countries. There are certain issues, though, that the Russian-speaking countries do prioritise, and I will be highlighting them as we go along. I guess defecation plein air, maybe in the Russian-speaking countries, that's not such a problem as it is perhaps in parts of Africa, say. It always reminds me when I was traveling around India, in 2003, I was in India, spent 7 weeks there. I was always amazed when you pull into any town or city in the morning and you just see for miles on miles just people out doing their business out in the open. That is really a full-on open-air defecation, as the expression goes. Indicators: proportion of population using safely managed sanitation services, a hand washing facility with soap and water. By 2030, improve water quality by reducing pollution, eliminating dumping and minimizing release of hazardous chemicals and materials, halving the proportion of untreated wastewater, and substantially increasing recycling and safe reuse globally. So there are a couple of interesting expressions here, especially here. Eliminating dumping and minimizing release of hazardous chemicals and materials. And I know I can't remember. Vertimiento, I think in Spanish, was it vertimiento? Eliminando el vertimiento, okay, in the Spanish. And in French, dumping, l'immersion de déchets. That's dumping. I wouldn't have known that. You see, if I'd heard that coming from the French, if I'd heard, for éliminer l'immersion de déchets, I'd have probably just said, eliminating the immersion of waste. But anyway, now you know, you see, so immersion de déchets is dumping. And then, okay, halving the hazardous chemicals and materials. Just want to point out, in the French and Spanish, it just tends to be dangereux, peligroso. But in English, when you talk about chemicals and things like that usually we might use, the word we go for is hazardous. So it's not dangerous. If you want to really sound professional, you would say hazardous. And untreated wastewater, that's again another important concept, I would say. And here, aguas residuales, okay, not residual waters. Yeah, that might be what if you're going into English, you might be inclined to say that. You might be inclined if you hear it. Yeah, you might be inclined to say residual waters, but it's not. Aguas residuales sin tratar, that's untreated wastewater. And in French, d'eau usée non traitée. Okay, so wastewater, d'eau usée. So it's important to spot these, okay? Spot these ahead of time. That's why you watch the episode, right? Okay. So, and then the indicators. As I say, unfortunately, other languages, they don't have the indicators, but we'll just go through them anyway. Proportion of domestic and industrial wastewater flows safely treated. Proportion of bodies of water with good ambient water quality. I know last in goals 1 to 5, they often talk about ambient air quality. So this is obviously a thing, this idea of ambient around you, right? Here's ambient water quality. And I think I looked it up I looked up French and Spanish. I think they just say ambient, ambiente. Extérieur also, I think they said for air, ambient air, l'air extérieur. So you should be able to spot it. Target 6.4, by 2030, substantially increase water use efficiency across all sectors, ensure sustainable withdrawals and supply of fresh water to address water scarcity and substantially reduce the number of people suffering from water scarcity. The most important thing here is water scarcity, just that collocation, scarcity. I think if you look at the other languages, right, I think they talk about manque. As in French, they talk about here, pénurie d'eau, manque d'eau, so they mention it twice use a different word. You see, if I was just manque d'eau, my reaction would probably be to say like a lack of water, which is kind of right, but the again the buzz expression is water scarcity, okay, and then l'eau douce, fresh water. You should know that probably. Abastecimiento de agua dulce, supply of fresh water. So it's important to recognize that. At this level, at your level, I think you should be knowing what agua dulce is. Fresh water as opposed to seawater, right? Salt water. Okay, and the indicators for 6.4, change in water use efficiency over time, level of water stress, freshwater withdrawal as a proportion of available freshwater resources. This withdrawal, in fact, sustainable withdrawals, that comes up, yeah. So what do they say in the French? I don't remember. Retrait, la viabilité des retraits on eau douce withdrawals. I've not heard, see, I didn't know that was a thing. And here it's extracción in Spanish. Again, if I was to hear that in Spanish, extracción de agua dulce, my knee-jerk reaction might be to say extraction, but withdrawal, it seems to be a recognized concept, shall we say. The water stress, again, they mentioned this notion. They mentioned it in the graphic as well, so maybe that's something you should just be familiar, just recognize water stress. 6.5, by 2030, implement integrated water resource management at all levels, including through transboundary cooperation as appropriate. So there's, again, this idea of transboundary cooperation, which I think is in the other... coopération transfrontière. Okay, so it's not trans-frontier, trans-border, but trans-boundary. When you're talking about these bodies of water and the cooperation that exists over them, it's transboundary. Yeah, the transboundary waterways is an expression they use. Often, as I say, it's usually used in terms of shared geographical resources, shall we say. Shared geographical features. Degree of integrated water resource management, proportion of transboundary basin area with an operational arrangement for water cooperation. The transboundary basins. Okay, that's the expression actually that really is used to describe these rivers and lakes, transboundary basins. And actually, if you just want to find out a little bit more, see, this has got some good information here. Transboundary waters, okay. This is one of the UN pages. UN water might be a good source. Transboundary waters are the aquifers and lake and river basins shared by two or more countries. In an era of increasing water stress, so they like this water stress, don't they? Mismanaged water supplies have the potential to cause social unrest and spark conflict. And so it just tells you again here about transboundary waters, transboundary cooperation, and so on. So that might give you a bit more information there. Okay, going back to here then. Target 6.6 by 2020, protect, restore water-related ecosystems, including mountains, forests, wetlands, rivers, aquifers, and lakes. So there's my old friend wetlands, okay? Humedales, you'll see in the Spanish, you see. Humedales, there you go. And we said in the French that this was les zones humides. Okay, they're not humid zones. They're wetlands is the expression. And what's it in the Russian out of interest? See, I wouldn't have known this. Look at so vodno-bolotnych ugodий is our wetlands. I mean, I think I have run into it. I seem to remember there was some meeting I was at several months ago. I think it was one of the stands that was basically describing the country's geography, all the various geographical features there. And I think they did talk about vodno-bolotnych ugodий, and then aquifers, okay? Vodonosny sloi for an aquifer. Wouldn't have known that. That's tough. You know, that's the thing with for example, in Russian, you know, these things are talked about less generally, but then when they are talked about, which does happen, they can really catch you out. So at least, okay, look, we know now, okay? Vodonosny sloi is an aquifer. And it also reminds me of what early in my interpreting days at the UN, maybe within the first year, I got hit with a meeting. It was a speaker in French, and they talked about nappe phréatique. And I didn't have a clue what that was. A nappe phréatique. So my booth mate told me afterward that's a water table, which I think is pretty much the same as an aquifer. Anyway, just there's another bit of useful vocab, because that's come up quite a bit, that expression. I don't know if we're going to run into it here in the goals, but une nappe phréatique is a water table or an aquifer. 661, change in the extent of water-related ecosystems over time. Target 6.8, by 2030, expand international cooperation and capacity building support to developing countries in water and sanitation-related activities and programs, including water harvesting, desalination, water efficiency, wastewater treatment, recycling, and reuse technologies. So that's interesting. Water harvesting. What's that concept in the other languages? Collecte d'eau. Oh, that's pretty boring, isn't it? You'd think the French would come up with something more interesting than that, but okay. I think you'd probably just say water collection, but there you go. You know the official expression is actually water harvesting, and in Spanish they talk, captación. Captación de agua. Oh, okay, that's useful to be able to recognize, okay, water harvesting. I did come across, speaking of captation, in French the other day, I think it was captage de charbon, or captage de méthane. They were talking about methane, perhaps. They were talking about captage. And so that was sequestration. Okay, carbon sequestration, the captage de charbon. So you might get that word in the French as well. Okay. And these other ones are pretty logical. Okay, aguas residuales, again, wastewater. That's important, right? Indicators, amount of water and sanitation related official development assistance, ODA, okay, remember that is part of government coordinated spending plan. ODA is an acronym you'll run into a lot. 6B, support and strengthen the participation of local communities in improving water and sanitation management. Proportion of local administrative units with established operational policies and procedures for participation of local communities in water and sanitation management. Okay, let's go on then to goal 7. Goal 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. These adjectives, they come up all the time, don't they? Affordable, reliable, sustainable. Resilience, not in this one, but I think that's another one that goes in that sort of package, right? Let's have a look at the graphic. Impressive progress in electrification has slowed due to the challenge of reaching those hardest to reach. Okay, number of people without electricity. International financial flows to developing countries for renewables declined for a second year in a row. Renewable is a useful word in English because it's one word. So often in other languages they'll talk about les énergies renouvelables. So you don't really need to say renewable energies when it's quicker just to say renewables. And everyone knows what you're talking about. Progress in energy efficiency needs to speed up to achieve the global climate goals. Annual energy intensity improvement rate. All right. 2.4 billion people still use inefficient and polluting cooking systems. Total renewable energy consumption increased by a quarter between 2010 and 19. The share of renewables in total final energy consumption is only... Okay. Let's have a look at the targets then. Targets and indicators. By 2030, ensure universal access to affordable, reliable and modern energy services. And the indicators: proportion of population with access to electricity, proportion of population with primary reliance on clean fuels and technology. Clean fuels, I guess, is énergie propre, right? 7.2, by 2030, increase substantially the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. Okay, this is an important concept, the idea of this share of renewable energy. Okay, la part. I think in that was in French, right? Okay, la part de l'énergie renouvelable. Okay, the share of renewable energy. And now look at this also. I know in Spanish it's proporción. La proporción de energía renovable. But let's look at this. I like this. The global energy mix. Now this is something I did not know until last night. Look at this in French. This is lovely. Le bouquet énergétique mondial. I did not know that was the bouquet. How French. That's lovely, isn't it? And I was hoping for something typically stereotypically Spanish from the Spanish version, but it was a bit of a disappointment. Did they just say el conjunto de fuentes energéticas? But so, okay, remember that. If you hear le bouquet énergétique mondial, that is the global energy mix. Ooh, I like that. Bouquet. Indicators. Renewable energy share, there you go again, in the total final energy consumption. 7.3, by 2030, double the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency. The indicator energy intensity measured in terms of primary energy and GDP. 7A, by 2030, enhance international cooperation to facilitate access to clean energy research and technology, including renewable energy, energy efficiency, and advanced and cleaner fossil fuel technology, and promote investment in infrastructure and clean energy technology. Okay, just this idea of cleaner fossil fuel technology might be good to just see in the other languages. Combustible, fuel. For some reason, that's a word from French. When I hear combustible, I struggle a bit and it's just fuel, isn't it? It's just fuel. Combustible fossile propre, okay, clean fossil fuels. And I think it's pretty much the same in the Spanish, okay? Energía limpia, okay, they just say energía, fuentes renovables. And in Russian, it's very important, again, because you don't hear it as much, it's just important to know what the buzzword is. Okay, использование ископаемого топлива. Ископаемого, that's the key word, right, for fossil fuels. Ископаемого топлива. 7B, by 2030, expand infrastructure, upgrade technology for supplying modern and sustainable energy services for all in developing countries. In particular, the least developed countries, the LDCs, les PMA, pays moins avancés. Small island developing states, so we have an orgy of acronyms coming up here. The SIDS, okay. Landlocked developing countries, les LLDC. Oh, sorry, I might talk in a French accent. LLDCs. In French, it's important to recognise that one. Okay, it's if I'm not mistaken, les pays sans littoral. Okay, pays en développement sans littoral. That's the LLDCs. You don't tend to hear them. You'll hear petits états insulaires en développement. You might hear les PID. You might hear that, but you wouldn't hear. So when you hear the pays en développement sans littoral, the LDCs. And in Russian, again, it's useful to be able to recognize these, perhaps. Малых островных развивающихся государств for the SIDS, and развивающие страны, не имеющие выхода к морю, okay, landlocked countries. So again, important to recognize those. And the indicators there: installed renewable energy generating capacity in developing countries in watts per capita. Okay, so that's goal 7. Goal 8. Okay, goal 8 now. Promote sustained, inclusive, sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Decent work, that's an important concept. I think this is sort of terminology that is sort of derived probably from the International Labour Organization, the ILO. So anyway, decent work. I know there's in some languages there might be a temptation to interpret it into English by saying dignified work. Because I think in Russian, for example, достойная, they talk about достойная работа. So you might think, well, dignified work, but no, decent work is the collocation you need. Okay, so let's have a look at the graphic again. Global economic recovery is hampered by. Okay, that's that's one of my favourite words. Hampered. It's always good to remember this. Just generally to have these synonyms for hampered, such as hindered, impeded, obstructed. Okay, that's one of my famous semantic fields, as they say here in France, when they talk about packages of synonyms. Okay, new waves of COVID-19, hooray. Rising inflation, supply chain disruptions, that's an important issue. Supply chain, okay, I think that gets mentioned in the targets. Policy uncertainties, labour market challenges. Global economic recovery is further set back by the Ukraine crisis. Okay, annual growth rate of global real GDP per capita. Global unemployment to remain above pre-pandemic level until at least 2023. 1 in 10 children engaged in child labour worldwide. Worker productivity has rebounded, but not in the LDC. That's interesting. It has rebounded. Because, in French, they might say, rebondé. Yeah, you might say that, rebondé. So you can in English that works quite well. Has rebounded. The economy has rebounded. That's a useful maybe addition to have, rather than we're talking about has recovered, rejuvenated, a rebound. I might start using that one. Okay, targets and indicators then. 8.1. Sustain per capita economic growth in accordance with national circumstances, and in particular at least 7% GDP growth per annum in the least developed countries. Annual growth rate of real GDP per capita. So it might be useful to know per capita. Okay, this sounds very, this is high register. If you're talking things per capita, okay, in English per capita, and per annum, it sets you apart from the crowd of interpreters, especially if you're, if you can come up with those Latin phrases. So in French, par habitant, okay, per capita. I mean, I think you can say per inhabitant, per head of the population. I know you say that in English, but sometimes that's a real mouthful. So per capita is a very good, effective, high register solution for that. And in Spanish, probably the same, I'm guessing. Por habitante. Per capita, they say in Spanish per capita. Okay. Okay, annual growth rate, right. Target 8.2, achieve high levels of economic productivity through diversification, technological upgrading and innovation, including through a focus on high value added and labor intensive sectors. So this word upgrading, it comes up a few times here. And it's not a word I would immediately use in English. But it's a perfectly good word. I'm just saying that's one to maybe add to your arsenal of words. So, because in French they just talk about la modernisation. This is Spanish, la modernisation technologique. In French, la modernisation. So I think upgrade is one. Maybe add that as a synonym to improve, to enhance. High value added and labor intensive sectors. So this is something I think in Russian it's good to recognize this expression. I think in French and Spanish it's pretty straightforward. They just say forte intensité de main d'œuvre. So you can more or less guess that. High labor force and labor intensity. But yeah, in Russian it's maybe not so obvious. So трудоемкие секторы. Okay, трудоемкость, labor intensivity. That's an important thing to recognize. They also talk about for upgrading, modernizacja. Indicators. Annual growth rate of real GDP per employed person. 8.3, promote development-oriented policies that support productive activities, decent job creation. So here we go again, decent job. Entrepreneurship, creativity and innovation, and encourage the formalization and growth of micro, small, medium-sized enterprises, including through access to financial services. This is an important package of words, okay. Micro, small, medium-sized enterprises, MSMEs, that gets mentioned quite a bit, okay. In the French, it is des micro-entreprises et des petites et moyennes entreprises, okay. Certainly I know that petites et moyennes entreprises, les PME, I think you hear that quite a bit. But anyway, so you will hear that acronym. I think used certainly in English. MSMEs. If you say MSMEs, your collocutor should understand what you're talking about. At least if they're in that meeting on that sort of issue in that context. And I think the French do use that acronym as well. The MPME. And in Spanish, it is microempresas y las pequeñas y medianas empresas. Again, pretty much the same, right? MPME. Indicators: proportion of informal employment in total employment by sector and sex. Target 8.4: improve progressively through 2030 global resource efficiency in consumption and production. Endeavour to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation in accordance with a 10-year framework of programmes on sustainable consumption and production, with developed countries taking the lead. Yeah, sustainable consumption and production, that's an important package of words that will often get used. Even, if I remember doing it a couple of times when I was back in New York, there would be whole weeks of meetings dedicated to the issue of sustainable consumption and production. I mean, SCP, you could probably say the 10-year framework of programs on SCP. Environmental degradation, remember I was saying again, so not deterioration, but degradation. This is a good expression in English, to take the lead, with developed countries taking the lead. How do they do that in French? Les pays développés montrent l'exemple en la matière. I mean, I might just say setting the example in the field, but yeah, taking the lead is a good alternative. And so in Spanish, you just say empezando por los países desarrollados. Indicators: material footprint per capita, material footprint per GDP, domestic material consumption per capita, domestic material consumption per GDP. Target 8.5: by 2030 achieve full productive employment and decent work for all women and men, including for young people and persons with disabilities, equal pay for work of equal value. This is an important concept, equal pay for work of equal value. I think this goes back to one of these ILO conventions. Let's see what they say in the other languages for that, for the exact wording. Salaire égal pour un travail de valeur égale. Spanish. Igualdad de remuneración por trabajo de igual valor. Okay, so it's just useful to remember that again as a package. Equal pay, basically equal pay for equal work. For short, full version: equal pay for work of equal value. Okay, indicators: average hourly earnings of female and male employees by occupation, age, and persons with disabilities. Unemployment rate by sex, age, and person with disabilities. So yes, I think that word remuneración is useful to, earnings, basically salary, wages, especially for you non-native English speakers, to have that sort of package of possible solutions. Target 8.6: by 2020 substantially reduce the proportion of youth not in employment, education, or training. Proportion of youth aged 15 to 24 not in education and employment. That's fairly straightforward. 8.7: take immediate effective measures to eradicate forced labour, end modern slavery and human trafficking, secure the prohibition, elimination of the worst forms of child labour, including a recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2020 end child labour in all its forms. That's something that the Russians, the Belarusians, are quite big on. I know that's something that they tend to flag up as a priority. I think it's fairly straightforward vocab. I know in the Russian recruitment is verbovka. Включая вербовку, использование детей солдат. Yeah. And in the French, I think it's all, esclavage moderne, la traite, very important, la trata in Spanish. Interdire, éliminer, prohibit. For interdire, outlaw. Again, in English is another sort of synonym. It's all fairly. I think if you hear that, you could more or less render it into English without having to know the background too much. It's pretty straightforward vocab. 8.8, and the indicators there: proportion and number of children aged 5 to 17 engaged in child labour by sex and age. Target 8.8: protect labour rights, promote safe, secure working environments for all workers, including migrant workers, in particular women migrants and those in precarious employment. So the issue of migrant workers has become something of a priority in recent years. There's a whole treaty body devoted to the rights of migrant workers and the members of their families, which has about that. There's a convention that has about 60, 70 signatories of the countries around the world. So it's important issue. This was, I thought, interesting vocab, this precarious employment, because I know in French they love talking about le travail, emploi précaire, travail précaire. I'm never happy when I trying to put it into English. I then talk about job instability. I think is what it is usually the best equivalent in English. But so it's English. It's interesting that they use it here in the English version, precarious employment. I think this is all to do with the gig economy, isn't it? Informal work, short-term work. Indicators: fatal, non-fatal occupational injuries per 100,000 workers by sex and migrant status. Level of national compliance with labour rights, freedom of association, collective bargaining based on International Labour Organization, textual sources and national legislation by sex and migrant status. This is an important idea, okay? Collective bargaining. And I think in French it's like négociation collective. It's a very important concept. So I'll be putting together a vocab, a sort of glossary on some of these words from all the goals that I haven't found a direct translation for into the other languages. So that's one of those, I think, that will be important. Collective bargaining. 8.9, by 2030, devise and implement policies to promote sustainable tourism that creates jobs and promotes local culture and products. Just here, devise is a good word, is a good synonym to have when you talk about devising plans, policies, devising documents. The other day I was looking for something different to say to drawing up or developing, and I couldn't think of it. There you go, devise. Also starts with a D. Indicator: tourism, direct GDP as a proportion of total GDP and in growth rate. 8.10, strengthen the capacity of domestic financial institutions to encourage and expand access to banking, insurance and financial services for all. Indicators: number of commercial bank branches per 100,000 adults, number of ATMs per 100,000 adults, proportion of adults with an account at a bank or other financial institution or with a mobile money service provider. Bank branch, okay, sucursal in Spanish as well. I think the ATMs, distributeur. 8A, increase aid for trade support for developing countries, in particular least developed countries, including through the Enhanced Integrated Framework for Trade-Related Technical Assistance, the LDCs. In this concept of aid for trade is an important thing maybe to recognise. In the French, it is l'initiative Aide pour le commerce. Okay, fairly, I mean, as long as you know, it's easy to remember the English, isn't it? Because it rhymes. Aid for trade. Okay, it trips off the tongue quite nicely. Spanish, what is it in Spanish? Ayuda para el comercio. Nothing very exciting, but certainly I say the English version is quite memorable, shall we say. Indicators: aid for trade commitments and disbursements. That's a good high register word. I think you just talk about what déboursement in French, and in Spanish gastos, and desembolsos, I think is the other one. So if you want, you can talk about spending. I mean, if you were to hear that in Spanish, you just said, okay, it's spending or expenditure, it's fine, I guess. Disbursements is a good word. Target 20B, by 2020, develop, operationalise a global strategy for youth employment, implement the Global Jobs Pact of the ILO. Okay, so this is actually, so on this occasion, it's in English, is the use of the word pact, okay? Because you remember, in French, in Spanish, they talk about le Pacte International pour les droits civils et politiques, where in English that goes into a covenant. But here, this is same also for the other covenant on economic, social and cultural rights, but here it's the pact, okay? Existence of a developed, operationalised national strategy for youth employment as a distinct strategy or as part of a national employment strategy. Okay, that's goal number 8 then. Okay, SDG 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive, sustainable industrialisation and foster innovation. Okay, resilient, that's a favourite word, right? At the UN, resilience. Things like robustness, resilience, okay. Foster innovation, it's a good word. There's always a good solution for the word in Spanish, fomento, whatever it may be, just because the FO at the start of the word. What is it in Spanish, actually? Goal 9. There we go, fomentar la innovación. So that's exactly the word they use. And I think in French, I don't think they use, I think it's promouvoir. Encourager l'innovation, they say in the French. Encourager, okay. So let's have a look at the targets and indicators in English. Okay, let's have a look at, first of all, at the little graphic. Global manufacturing has rebounded from the pandemic. There's this word rebounded again, which I say I might start using. LDCs left behind, manufacturing growth. Small-scale industries lack access to financial support for recovery. Recovery is always an important word, okay. We talk about the post-pandemic recovery in English. Where are we here? High technology industries are far more resilient in crises than their lower tech counterparts. Medium technology, okay. What have we got here? Only 1 in 3 small manufacturers are benefiting from a loan or a line of credit. Passenger airline industry still struggling to recoup catastrophic losses. That's a good word, maybe to recoup, rather than, I think maybe you would, the temptation to say, to regain or to recover, but that's a good collocation with losses, okay, to recoup losses, particularly financial ones. 2.3 billion passengers in 2021 compared with 4 billion in 2019. 1 in 3 manufacturing jobs negatively impacted by the crisis. Okay, that's a good, again, collocation, then negatively impacted, adversely impacted, again, as an alternative to not always having to say negative. Targets and indicators there. 9.1. Develop quality, reliable, sustainable, resilient infrastructure, including regional and trans-border infrastructure to support economic development and human well-being with a focus on affordable and equitable access for all. It's trans-border infrastructure. We were talking about trans-boundary before. Let's see if there's any reason why that. Let's see what they say in the French. Transfrontière again, okay. I guess maybe trans-boundaries to do again with geographical features, perhaps. That's a minor point. Indicators proportion of the rural population who live within 2 kilometres of an all-season road. I've not heard that expression before, but that could be that could crop up. Passenger and freight volumes by mode of transport. Okay, freight is a very sort of high register. I think it's something in UK English we often use to talk about just goods. You know, talk about freight transport, goods transport, goods lorries, goods vehicles, freight vehicles. I don't know if freight is maybe more American English, but I think, anyway, they're pretty much interchangeable. I can imagine myself using either or, actually, freight or goods. But it's important to distinguish between passenger traffic on the one hand and freight on the other, or goods traffic on the other. 9.2. Promote inclusive single industrialization. By 2030, significantly raise industry's share of employment and gross domestic product in line with national circumstances. Double its share in the least developed countries. I think that's fairly straightforward. Indicators. Manufacturing value added as a proportion of GDP and per capita. Manufacturing employment as a proportion of total employment. Increase the access of small-scale industrial and other enterprises, in particular in developing countries, to financial services, including affordable credit and their integration into value chains and markets. Just this notion here, small-scale industrial and other enterprises. So I know in the French it's like, okay, les petites entreprises industrielles. So, I mean, in French, in English, if you have to hear that, and in English you said, okay, small industrial enterprises, I guess that'd be okay to say. But the sort of, again, the in vogue expression seems to be small scale. Okay, small scale industries. I think we've heard that, yeah. I think that's come up, that came up in the graphic as well, perhaps. Proportion of small-scale industries and total industrial value added. Proportion of small-scale industries with a loan or line of credit. So yeah, small-scale industries. I think it's just worth remembering. And I just looked up this expression here. This line of credit seems to be an important thing. And in French, it just gave me crédit. In the Spanish, it gave me línea de crédito. That's maybe again sort of an important concept, a line of credit. Target 9.4, by 2030 upgrade infrastructure and retrofit industries to make them sustainable with increased resource use efficiency, greater adoption of clean and environmentally sound technologies and industrial processes, with all countries taking action in accordance with their respective capabilities. Okay, there's important sort of collocations here. Upgrade infrastructure, and we were talking about that before in the French and the other languages. They were saying moderniser for upgrade. Let's see what they use here. Moderniser l'infrastructure again. What about Spanish? Modernizar again. So, okay, if you hear modernizar, you sort of upgrade seems to be a good solution there. Again, in the Russian, modernizovat infrastrukturu. Retrofit industries. Now that's an interesting concept. Okay, so what about in French? They say adapter les industries. So that's a bit boring. Just adapter les industries. It's not like the bouquet from earlier on. I expected something a bit fancier from the French there. Never mind. Spanish, reconvertir. It's a bit more, slightly more audacious, but in Spanish. Retrofit is very good. You know, when they talk, retrofitting facilities and things. They usually talk about, cars, retrofit cars, turning, with old classic cars and then retrofitting them with, installing like a brand new engine, though, a modern engine. That's the idea of retrofit. It's an important concept, again, to recognise, at least. Certainly if you hear it, perhaps, if you're not a non-English native and you hear it, and that word retrofit, to recognise what it means. Environmentally sound technologies. Okay, that's a good collocation. Environmentally sound. In the French, they say respectueux de l'environnement. Okay, so if I was to hear that, I might be tempted to say environmentally friendly technologies, but environmentally sound, again, that's good. Ambientalmente racionales for environmentally sound. Okay. I might say environmentally rational. Doesn't sound as good, but anyway. So environmentally friendly, environmentally sound. Those are good collocations, like I say. 9.5, enhance scientific research, upgrade technological capabilities of industrial sectors in all countries, in particular developing countries, including by 2030, encouraging innovation, substantially increasing the number of research and development workers per 1 million people, and public and private research and development spending. A lot of words there, but they're all, I think, fairly straightforward, to be honest. Indicators, research and development expenditure as a proportion of GDP. Research is in full-time equivalent per million inhabitants. 9A, facilitate sustainable, resilient infrastructure development in developing countries through enhanced financial, technical support to African countries, the LDCs, the LLDCs, landlocked developing countries, and the SIDS. Again, these often tend to come in a package. The LDCs, the LLDCs, and the SIDS. You can save yourself a lot of time there if you know those acronyms. Total official international support, official development assistance plus other flows to infrastructure. Okay. 9B, support domestic technology development, research, innovation in developing countries, including by ensuring a conducive policy environment for inter alia industrial diversification, value addition to commodities. This conducive policy environment, another thing you hear often in English is an enabling environment. I think in French it's probably what, propice, conditions propice, okay, conducive conditions, enabling conditions. Spanish, what do we have? Entorno propicio, normativo propicio. While we're at it, let's see what the Russians say. Благоприятствующего. Diversificacja, okay, благоприятствующий. So for conducive or enabling. Commodities. Let's see what they say. That's an important word. Let's see, in the French, they talk about marchandises. I thought they were denrées. Denrées is a word I sometimes hear in French, which I will often render into commodities in English. Denrées alimentaires. Productos básicos, okay, for commodities. So those are important. So you see basic products in English, that doesn't sound that great. So commodities. You can say foodstuffs. Denrées alimentaires. 9C, significantly increase access to information and communications technologies. Strive to provide universal, affordable access to the internet in least developed countries by 2020. Okay, that's an important acronym there. That'll save you a lot of time. ICTs, information communications technologies. Les CT, I think, in French, right? Les TIC, no, that's it. Technologie de l'information et de la communication. That is a French acronym. You'll hear les TIC. TIC. I think the same in Spanish, right? Tecnología de la información y las comunicaciones here. Indicators. Proportion of population covered by a mobile network by technology. Okay, so that's number 9 for you. So that's as far as I got last night when my computer crashed. So let's hopefully I can push on a bit beyond number 9. So SDG 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. Let's see. The graphic pandemic has caused the first rise in between country income inequality in a generation. Okay, I haven't heard that ever as an adjective, but there you go. Between country as an adjective. Between country income inequality. You never know, that might come in handy. Here we go again. Between country inequality, COVID projection. Okay. Global refugee figure hits record high. War in Ukraine pushes the world total even higher. Okay, 5,895 migrants lost their lives in 2021, deadliest year since 2017 for migrants. 1 in 5 people have experienced discrimination on at least one of the grounds prohibited under international human rights law. Number of refugees outside their country of origin increased by 44% between 2015 and 2021. That's an important concept. I can't remember I don't know if we'll get to it in the targets. Country of origin, country of destination, country of transit. Okay, it's important to remember those 3 concepts in a sort of package. Or host country is the other. I mean, the host country as well as the country where the refugees go to. Okay, so targets indicators. By 2030, progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. Growth rates of household expenditure or income per capita among the bottom 40% of the population, total population. By 2030, empower and promote the social, economic, political inclusion of all, irrespective of age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, or economic or other status. See what they say for empower and promote in our other languages. Okay, autonomiser, yeah, that's important to know. L'autonomisation des femmes, it's all about empowerment. So yeah, you should certainly know that from French. Spanish the same, probably. Potenciar, okay. Potenciare, promover, empower and promote. And this is a list of criteria that these criteria often come in a list that will be referred to in lots of different contexts. Proportion of people living below 60% of median income by sex, age, and persons with disabilities. I know they tend to focus more on median than average, like the median being the middle. It's a bit of a different measurement to average. I remember at school getting taught the difference between 3 different kinds of average: the mean, the median, and the mode. And I know the mode was the figure that came up most frequently. And the mean is like what we think of as the average between all the figures. And the median one was the actual middle one, regardless of how many were higher than it or lower than it. Target 10.3, ensure equal opportunity, reduce inequalities of outcome, including by eliminating discriminatory laws, policies and practices and promoting appropriate legislation, policies and action in this regard. This is all sort of policy wonk language. I don't think it should be particularly challenging from the other languages. Proportion of population reporting having personally felt discriminated against or harassed within the previous 12 months on the basis of a ground of discrimination prohibited under international human rights law. 10.4, adopt policies, especially fiscal, wage and social protection policies, and progressively achieve greater equality. See what they say. So les plans budgétaires salariales. Okay, it's interesting they talk about for fiscal. Okay, so fiscal, budgétaire in French. I mean, I would probably hear I say this on les plans at budgetary level, I'd probably end up saying, but fiscal level. Spanish, what do they say? Fiscales. Okay, so same as in the English. So that's an interesting difference. You non-native English speakers, you might sometimes wonder what the difference between a wage and a salary is. Well, like a salary tends to be, I always think of it as being higher. Okay, so I mean, I always connect sort of salaries with white-collar earnings. I tend to connect wages with sort of blue-collar earnings. They're kind of interchangeable, I think. I don't think there's a big, no one's ever going to call you out if you say wage when maybe the person wanted to hear salaries. So, but that to me is the difference between a wage and a salary. Okay, indicators, labour share of GDP. I mean, this whole, the share, le part, la proportion, redistributive impact of fiscal policy. Let's see what the Russians say actually about fiscal policy. Okay, бюджетную налоговую политику for fiscal policy. Okay, that's it. When you hear those again, one of those complicated double-barreled adjectives in Russian. Бюджетную налоговую политику. Fiscal, much easier to say than budgetary/tax policy. 10.5, improve regulation and monitoring of global financial markets and institutions. Strengthen implementation of such regulations. Financial soundness indicators. Okay. 10.6, ensure enhanced representation and a voice for developing countries in decision-making in global, international, economic and financial institutions in order to deliver more effective, creditable, accountable and legitimate institutions. Again, I think this is all fairly straightforward from your other languages. La prise de décision, it's this important, concept, decision-making institutions. But all the efficace, crédible, transparent, légitime, not that difficult. 10.7, facilitate orderly, safe, regular and responsible migration and mobility of people, including through the implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. So this is important, one package of words. Okay, orderly, safe, regular and responsible migration. This orderly is not always that obvious to spot. It's the first adjective in that group, and it's kind of important. Okay, de façon, there we go. La migration et mobilité de façon ordonnée sont dangers réguliers et responsables. So façon ordonnée, orderly. Okay, and in Spanish, I think it's ordenado. Okay, movilidad ordenadas. Okay. Another expression they'll use in that context. You'll often hear people on the move to describe sort of blanket term to cover refugees, IDPs, people on the move. I've just noticed here it's an important word, okay, regulation and monitoring of global financial markets. And so I just happened to notice that in French it was la surveillance des institutions. I know often when I hear surveillance, I often say oversight. But they go monitoring, and in Spanish, vigilancia de las monitoring. La vigilancia, I'll often actually say surveillance when the police are, secret surveillance of people, tapping their phone lines. That's the word they'll use in Spanish, vigilancia. Okay, when it comes to institutions, in this context, it's monitoring. So those are good words to have, oversight, monitoring. Surveillance in English is a bit different. Okay, surveillance is very much the idea of spying on people. A friendly way of saying spying on people. Surveillance. Just keeping an eye on you. 10.6. Ensure enhanced representation and voice for developing countries in decision-making in global, international, economic and financial institutions in order to deliver more effective, credible, accountable, legitimate... Oh, I've done that one. Okay, 10A. Implement the principle of special differential treatment for developing countries, in particular least developed countries, LDCs, in accordance with World Trade Organization agreements. This is something that gets brought up a lot. Special differential treatment. I'm sure I hear special differentiated treatment. That's an important concept to be able to properly render. Traitement spécial et différencié. Okay, so maybe that's why I always seem to say differentiated. Maybe I should be saying differential treatment. In Spanish, it is especial y diferenciado. Okay, important that. Just understanding that concept as well, so that, you know, I guess this is all the idea of equity, right? That the developing countries shouldn't be judged maybe by the exact same standards as the more developed countries. Okay, indicate a proportion of tariff lines apply to imports from LDCs and developing countries with zero tariff. 10B, encourage official development assistance financial flows, including foreign direct investment to states where the need is greatest, in particular least developed countries, African countries, SIDS, LDCs, in accordance with national plans and programs. Financial flows, I mean, they talk about this a lot in the indicators. This is the first time I've run into it in the actual target. So let's see what they say. Les flux, okay, les flux financiers, and presumably in Spanish it's los flujos. Oh, corrientes, there you go, corrientes financieras. If you hear corrientes, that's financial flows. And then this is important idea, foreign direct investment, which certainly in English you can just call it FDI. French, investissement étranger direct. Yeah, I've never heard that used as an acronym. But certainly it's a good shortcut in English, FDI. 10B1, indicate total resource flows for development by recipient and donor countries and type of flow, be it ODA, FDI and other flows. 10C, by 2030 reduce to less than 3% the transaction costs of migrant remittances and eliminate remittance corridors with costs higher than 5%. Okay, that's short target. There's quite a lot of important stuff there. Okay, the transaction costs... What do we have there? Coût de transaction in French. Costos de transacción in Spanish. And then this, okay, remittances. That's very important when they talk about migration. Migrants sending money back to their home countries. So in French, that is... Okay, they just... Okay, in French, les envois de fonds effectués par les migrants. That's not so... exciting, but yet in Spanish there is remesas. That's an important word to recognize from Spanish. Las remesas for remittances. Okay, remittance corridors. I'm not familiar with this. What are they called? Corredores de remesas, couloir de transfert de fonds. Okay, not something I can recall running into, but okay. Now we know that is a thing. Remittance corridors. Indicators remittance costs as a proportion of the amount remitted. Okay, so and then finally, last but not least, goal 11. Make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. This word is human settlements. Établissement humain, they say in French. Okay. So not human establishments. You know, if they were to use that, you might be... That would possibly catch me out, to be honest. Settlements. They just say ciudades here. In Spanish and Russian, do we have anything? Naselyonych punktov. Okay, that's obviously a word expression they use all the time in Russian, right? In all sorts of contexts. So here it's settlements. And I'm never certain... Exactly. I often say, you know, towns and villages, townships, when I hear that in Russian. Settlements. Is жизнестойкость, sustainability. That's a useful word, perhaps, to know. Safe or resilient. No, I tell a lie. Устойчивость, sustainability. Okay, so that's the word in Russian, it seems, that for resilience. жизнестойкость. Okay, remember that one. If you're a Russian speaker. If you don't speak Russian, I wouldn't worry too much. Targets and indicators. Oh, let's have a look at the graphic quickly. Okay, leaving no one behind. That's a favourite UN expression. Okay, laisser personne à côté. Is that what it was? That's a very high-profile sort of UN mantra. Leave no one behind. Will require an intensified focus on 1 billion slum dwellers. I wonder what that is in the other languages. Bidonville in French. Number of countries, local disaster risk reduction strategies nearly doubled between 2015 and 2021. As cities grow, municipal solid waste, that's important. Problems mount. Globally, municipal solid waste. I think we'll run into that in the target when we come to the targets. Sub-Saharan Africa, less than a third of city dwellers have convenient access to public transportation. 99% of the world's urban population breathes polluted air. All right. 11.1. By 2030, ensure access for all to adequate, safe, affordable housing, basic services, and upgrade slums. Okay, so let's see that this is important when they talk about, urbanization, anything to do with the city, right? So in Spanish, los barrios marginales. And so in French, is it les bidonvilles? Les taudis. I have run into that. Assainir les quartiers de taudis. I have heard that, and I'm pretty sure I've missed it. Okay, remember that. Okay, all you French C's in particular, les taudis. For slums, right? Upgrade. So upgrade slums in French is assainir. It's an interesting word for assainir. Okay, upgrade. Les quartiers de taudis. Indicators, proportion of urban population living in slums, informal settlements or inadequate housing. 11.2. By 2030, provide access to safe, affordable, accessible, sustainable transport systems for all. Improving road safety, notably by expanding public transport with special attention to the needs of those in vulnerable situations, women, children, persons with disabilities and older persons. It's getting pretty straightforward. Again, that's the Russians are quite concerned about that, the issue of road safety. Might not be a bad idea just to see what that is in Russian. Пользоваться безопасными дорогами, доступными, экологически устойчивыми транспортными системами, обеспечение безопасности дорожного движения, расширение использования общественного транспорта нужным тем. Okay, it's pretty straightforward though. Just remember invalidov, don't say invalids in English. Persons with disabilities, okay. Definitely don't say invalids. Indicators. Proportion of population that has convenient access to public transport by sex, age, persons with disabilities. Target 11.3. By 2030, enhance inclusive, sustainable urbanization and capacity for participatory, integrated, sustainable human settlement planning and management in all countries. What's that in Spanish? So again, la gestión participativa. Okay, asentamientos humanos. That was the word I was looking for. Okay, for human settlement. Asentamientos. So in French, établissement humain. Okay. Населенные пункты in Russian, I guess. Населенных пунктов, yeah. Indicators: ratio of land consumption rate to population growth rate, proportion of cities with direct participation, structure of civil society and urban planning and management that operate regularly and democratically. 11.4. Strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. 11.4. On total per capita expenditure on preservation, protection and conservation of all cultural and natural heritage by source of funding, public-private type of heritage, cultural and natural, level of government, national, regional, local, municipal. Okay, that should be straightforward enough. 11.5. By 2030, significantly reduce the number of deaths, number of people affected, substantially decrease the direct economic losses relative to global GDP caused by disasters, including water-related disasters, with a focus on protecting the poor and people in vulnerable situations. It's quite a mouthful, but I think it's fairly straightforward. Let's see in the French if there's anything Réduire, just like as a collocation, réduire considérablement, or significantly reduce, seems to be, the collocation you always hear. D'origine hydrique, anything to do with hydrique is water related. Okay. 11.6. By 2030, reduce the adverse per capita environmental impact of cities, including by paying special attention to air quality and municipal and other waste management. Okay, so let's find out how they talk about waste management. Gestion des déchets. Okay. There's that good synonym for negative, right? The adverse per capita impact. Spanish. Gestión de los desechos municipales. Okay, that should be fairly easy to spot. Indicators, proportion of municipal solid waste collected and managed in controlled facilities out of total municipal waste generated by cities. So I think I'll have to look up. Okay, annual mean levels of fine particulate matter. Oh, I've run into this kind of stuff before in cities. Solid waste and fine and particulate matter. I have run into that. So I'm going to put the at least the French, the Spanish equivalents up on the screen for you. I just looked up on a word reference, actually. It's not that difficult to spot. It's residuo sólido that gives me in Spanish déchet solide in French. But yeah, important though, solid waste, but particular matter I will find for you. By 11.7, by 2030, provide universal access to safe, inclusive and accessible green and public spaces, in particular for women, children, older persons with disabilities. Shouldn't be too difficult. Average share of the built-up areas of cities that is open space for public use for all by sex, age, person with disabilities. Proportion of persons victim of physical or sexual harassment by sex, age, disability, status, place of occurrence in the previous 12 months. 11a, support positive economic, social, environmental links between urban, peri-urban and rural areas by strengthening national and regional development planning. Again, I think that's fairly straightforward. Let's just see what they say for rural areas. Zone urbaine, peri-urbaine et rurale. Alright, that's easy. Spanish, urbanas, periurbanas et rurales. Again, that's not too difficult. Indicators, number of countries that have national urban policies or regional development plans that respond to population dynamics, ensure balanced territorial development and increase local fiscal space. 11b, by 2020, substantially increase the number of cities and human settlements adopting and implementing integrated policies and plans towards inclusion, resource efficiency, mitigation, adaptation to climate change, resilience to disasters, and development and implement in line with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction 2015-2030, holistic disaster risk management at all levels. This is an important concept, the resilience to disasters. I think we might have mentioned this in the last episode, but anyway, probably it's worth just mentioning again. Résilience face aux catastrophes. Interesting what the Russians say for that. Смягчение последствий. Oh no, sorry, I beg your pardon. Способность противостоять стихийным бедствиям, natural disasters, okay, противостоять. And then the idea also of the Sendai framework for action, for disaster risk reduction. That's an important concept, I think, that was adopted in the wake of the Fukushima disaster when you had the big tsunami in Japan. You want to recognize that. And they often talk about this idea of holistic disaster risk management. In French, what do they call that? Gestion globale des risques de catastrophe. Spanish, gestión integral de los riesgos. Russian, комплексному управлению связанными с риском. Okay, so holistic disaster risk management. That's one of those weird UN words. So I don't know if you can hear Jerry Lee Lewis playing outside. Can you hear that? Back from the dead. Target 11.c, the last one then for today. Support least developed countries, including through financial technical assistance in building sustainable and resilient buildings utilizing local materials. Is there anything interesting there? Bâtiment durable, résilient, utilisant des matériaux locaux. Construire edificios sostenibles resilientes. Okay, that's pretty easy. And the final indicator. There's no indicator for that one. Okay, so that is SDGs 6 to 11 for you. I hope you've learnt some new ideas. I hope you now will be able to perhaps recognize some of these concepts when they hit you in the heat of the action. And if you've learned anything new, tell me in the comments. Tell me what you've learned that's new. Tell me if you have any if there's any issue that we've talked about that maybe you can raise more that you can shed more light on. Please feel free to share. Some of them I'm not familiar. Some of these English expressions, even in the English, sometimes I just, I don't really know what they actually mean. All I'm concerned of as an interpreter is just being able to render them from the other languages into English. So I don't always know exactly what a certain concept is. If I can recognize it and put it into English, that's the main priority. But if you can shed some light on any of the elements that we've discussed, please feel free to do so. Okay, so I won't keep you back any longer. We'll be back with the final set of goals 12 to 17 in a week or two's time. And for now, all that is left to say, other than like, share, subscribe and all that, is that episode 148 of the Interpretation Station stands adjourned.